duty to introduce you to the last speaker, and it is quite a challenge. So if I was to ask Matthew Longo, it's him, how to present him, he'd say, everybody knows me, right? So everybody knows Matthew, and he's from Leiden University, he's written The Politics of Border, but I'll let him talk because that's why we're all here, right? And we still till the end about borders after COVID, and I'm looking forward to hear that. Thank you.
I just don't like that she said it was her duty to introduce me, not her pleasure. Teasing. Okay, so I have the position of being the barrier between you and the drinks, which is always the worst slot. I will try to not be verbose, but I'll be honest, that's not a talent of mine. So we'll do what we can. The question I think we're all asking is about borders and COVID. And I think all of us in this room, probably separately in our houses, have been pondering what this means. It's kind of the future of our discipline, of what we do, is this question. And I thought, oh, what a good idea. I'm going to spend some months figuring out what I think the concern is. That didn't happen. Instead, I created a list in my mind of basic things that all of us are saying over and over again of what's wrong with COVID. It's going to become ever more racialized and more profiling. My big fear when I started thinking about COVID in the very beginning in 2020 was we'd end up just having medicalization of everything so that all the existing things we wanted to do, all the people we wanted to exclude, we had a new justification for excluding them. Right? If you happen to come from a country that was poor and Muslim and dark-skinned and was far away, and we wanted a reason not to let you into the country, we would say, oh, we just don't buy your COVID tests. And then suddenly we had a reason to do all the things we did anyways, and all the rich white countries that are Christian and so forth get in, and those are excluded. That was the horrorscape we all felt, and in some degree, we've seen that come true. So I'm just going to start with a quote, and I've highlighted some words. So it's Rhys Jones, who everybody knows, that highlight for me what I think I want to do in this little talk, which is not to talk at all about the future, which I thought I was going to do. Okay? I'm going to read. In 2020, U.S. Citizenship Immigration Services closed all their offices overseas. At the same time, they began to require in-person interviews for green card applications. As the coronavirus pandemic spread globally, the administration used it to further crack down on immigration. The Migration Policy Institute found that beyond the sharp reduction in refugee admissions and the use of the pandemic as an excuse to shut down normal visa processes in 2020, it was likely to take many years to fully account for the impact of all but a small but significant change to immigration policies. Okay, that's the story we expect, right? So there's a pretext, COVID is a pretext to basically make all the deportation regimes, all the cutting off of visas, all the things that we thought anyways you'd do to tighten immigration, suddenly have some kind of justification behind it. Okay, to give a different example that's not academic, to give just a one you find on the web, I'm going to read another passage. As the COVID-19 pandemic intensifies around the world, we're witnessing countries making unprecedented decisions to close borders to non-citizens. The concern that travelers increase the risk of COVID-19 contagion is legitimate. However, border closures do not need to keep everyone out. Only those who are not citizens, blah, blah. In other words, states weigh their obligation towards solidarity and protection of citizens above the risk they may be carrying the virus. By contrast, outsiders, temporary residents or visitors, are banned from entry as asylum seekers or irregular migrants. I highlighted again the words weigh their obligation. Why? Because the concern that I want to talk about isn't actually anything per se about pandemic. It's more about the ways in which we're going to use it to allow moral judgment to come in. We're going to usher in moral judgment behind the pretext of something medicalized and scientific sounding. So here, by weigh their obligation, the word weigh is another way of saying we're going to justify, in this case, the preference of citizens over non-citizens. Okay, so with that said, what I actually want to talk about kind of has nothing to do with borders after COVID. It has to do with how we can think about the relationship of pandemic with borders, and in particular about how pandemic, in this case, is a justification right? How does it become a justification? Why do we let it be a justification? In what ways does that justification become salient, and so forth, as a way of understanding maybe the question of pandemic. So that's my initial question is about justification. But what I actually want to do, and this is the part that you're going to have to humor me, is not talk at all about the present, because I got a little bit bored of the present, in part because I don't think we know anything about the present yet. We don't really know what's going to happen in 10 years from what's happened so far. More interesting is to go backwards and ask whether or not prior pandemics, in particular in the US-Mexico borderlands, are instructive of, in particular, how we start to justify border changes in light of pandemic, okay? So what I'm gonna do is talk about two examples that I think are interesting, and also because of the nature of this project, I would like to say I wanted to do much more research than I've done for this than I should have, which is to say that I think the better version of this talk isn't actually about the US border. I think it's actually about, globally, the history of borders, right? So, for example, I gave this talk, an earlier stage of this talk in Hong Kong on Zoom. I mean, not like cool Hong Kong, like boring Zoom Hong Kong, but whatever. And the audience was filled with essentially Chinese and Hong Kong scholars, all of whom said, oh, it's crazy you're talking about only this US-Mexico border issue. Actually, the whole story of Hong Kong is built up around quarantines around pandemic. Okay. I didn't have time to do that research. Right. That's the small caveat. But there are two cases I think are instructive. Fine. Texas fever. So, oh, this is hard that it's behind me. Okay. Some of the history, I'm going to have to look back. I assume that most people here are quite familiar with the story of the rise of the US-Mexico border. I'll go quickly. I kind of wanted to include some in case that there are some of you that are not really US-Mexico border geeks. But those that are, this is going to be a little bit remedial. 1840s, borders agreed upon. Generally speaking, it was quite easy through the Texas area because the Rio Grande. The difficult part was cutting the line, and the cutting the line across what is now New Mexico and Arizona and California was quite difficult. It had to be actually demarcated and agreed upon. So I use a lot of, for the record, for this first part of the talk, Rachel St. John. If you haven't read this book, it's brilliant, and it's brilliant in part because she's funny, which is like weird. She has these amazing quotes she's found. So one of them, just to give an example, all of this is to set up more or less a picture of what it actually looked like in the US-Mexico borderlands in the 1850s and 60s and 70s as we approach the turn of the century. But the quote she gives is, so this is from the Boundary Commissioner, on paper one easily draws a line with a ruler and a pencil, but on land it's not the same. That's like this very understated way of saying it was an absolute clusterfuck to go out in the middle of the desert in high heat with bandits and Apaches, and people were dying left and right to try to draw this line. It was absolutely not just undemarcated, it was also, there was no institutions, there was nothing. It was basically open territory as far as the borderers were concerned, which is a nicer way of saying it was other people's territory, but let's not talk about that. Okay, so generally speaking, demarcation happens 1850s. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, mostly because I can't read what's behind me. But generally speaking, what happens is the rail comes, 1870s, huge changes, also with gold rush. You start to have, essentially, in the border areas, development. Development is great in a certain sense. It brings, this whole bustling civilization of small towns. What matters for our purposes is that all of that trade happened without real border demarcation. Right? So you didn't really know where the border was, and the authorities couldn't control any kind of border in those years, in the 1870s. So to give some quotes, because again, she's so fabulous, and then I'll move on to other texts, but the beginning she's really good on. I want to read just a little bit to give you a picture of what it felt like to be out in tumbleweed country, 110-degree tumbleweed country, which many of you here live in, and given how cold it is outside, I somewhat envy. So here are two quotes. The first is from the International Boundary Commission of 1896, and this period was defined as open yet lawful evasions of customs duties. Okay? At this point, that means we have a demarcated line, we cannot control it, and so things are open. It's almost unimaginable now with the way we think of borders that you could even have such an expression. It's almost mind-boggling, this idea of open yet lawful evasions. Like, what is a lawful evasion? It is the law saying we cannot regulate this, so it's against the law, but mazel tov. You know, what are we going to do? Okay. And then my favorite quote of hers, which is a period about law enforcement in the Douglas Daily Dispatch. This is also in the same time period, roughly in the 1890s. The officer who goes down there at night finds it impossible to tell where the line is and whether he's arresting a man in the US or in Mexico. Okay. Again, wild. It's not just saying we can't control anything crossing the border. It's saying we don't know where the border is. We don't know what side of the border you're on. We don't know which law we should be enforcing. Law enforcement is throwing up its arms saying this is just, you know, this is not what this border's doing. All of that's picture painting, okay? So how do we then go from this picture, which feels just so alien to anything any of us think about this particular border area, to what we have now? And one of the answers, okay, one of the answers to this question that's interesting is the pandemic played a really big role, okay? And again, the facticity of it, I'm not that interested in for this talk. I'm more interested in how it's justified, okay? So, Texas fever, 1880s. For anybody that's actually looked into the history of this and you read a little bit around it, it's incredibly wild. So you have this problem of basically ticks on cattle. Cattle roam free, ticks travel freely, and they cross the border. That's all Texas fever really means, right? And if you're the law, you know, if you're law enforcement, this starts to present a kind of problem you should be concerned with. That isn't just, well, some guy was selling whiskey for 10 cents less on this side than the other, we're just going to let it fly. This is suddenly possibly really big. Okay. So the question is, how do you prevent cattle from crossing a demarcated but unprotected and mostly undemarcated border? All right. Lots of regulations. So new attempts at inspections and tariffs. For those who've ever seen images, I couldn't find a good still because I thought, okay, last talk before drinks, put pictures in, but I didn't put pictures in. But you're going to imagine a picture, which is wild, which is what they would do is lift the cows, okay, with cranes and dip them basically in like, you know, toxic, noxious fluids, which wouldn't kill the cows, but would kill the ticks. All right, genius solution, which we would later do with people, but we'll get there. And, but the images were insane. You had basically riots. So you had cattle farmers totally pissed off that you were abusing their animals. Think if you're a cattle farmer. You spend your day with your cattle. You love your cattle, and here they're dipped in toxic fluids. You know, you're totally angry. Ranchers were unhappy. The police were unhappy. They didn't feel they could regulate it. They felt humiliated, basically. So you have this huge problem where, on the one hand, you had to get rid of the ticks. And on the other, every single actor, every agent that had some kind of dominion was angry at the process of getting rid of ticks. Someone could make a great movie of this, like a parody. Okay, whatever. So the question is, how do we get forward? By 1909, we have, finally, the first federally funded fencing on the border, okay? So that looks exactly in a way like you'd expect it would. Eventually they say, this is not sustainable, we're gonna start to create fencing to keep your Mexican tick-infested cows on your side and our newly purified, dunked cows on our side with a fence. But interestingly, this is 30 years later. So how did it get to the point at which it starts to be justified? Where you start to say, we're going to go so far as to make fencing. We're going to get funding for it. We're going to go against all of the local interests, which is the interesting bit, because all of the local ranchers really wanted this to be an area in which their cattle can roam free. And so the question is, how did you start to justify it? And this is where it gets interesting. So there's a couple of theses when you read around this literature. One thesis is, in order to be justified, it had to be racialized. It couldn't be a tick, it had to be a Mexican tick, which is the most perverse comment anyone's ever made, and yet totally appreciable, but whatever. Okay, Eula Biss, who wrote a book on immunity, for those of you who are interested in COVID stuff, totally pick up this book. It's brilliant, it's beautiful, it's short, and it's about basically the story of vaccinations historically. And she basically says that it took smallpox, right, already 20 years, but not 30 years after the Texas fever, which became called the Mexican bump, which is another just, epidemic began, to start to say, well, this tick is actually part of a bigger picture of essentially a pandemic, of the kind of viral problem, and a viral problem that comes from Mexico. Interestingly, it was also called the Italian itch, because why only profile one race you want to get rid of? Why not make it all immigrants that get sucked in? Apparently also the Irish. There are incredibly vulgar things also about blacks involving this, but I kept the two that there are worse things I could have put up there. Just bear me out, it all became racialized. Okay. So now we have the first thesis. And the first thesis should be pretty recognizable. We justify the walling because it's part of this bigger picture. But the other thing you get in this literature, and this is a particularly good book for those of you who are kind of US-Mexico borderlands geeks and really want to build up your own knowledge of how that border got developed. This is C.J. Alvarez's Borderland, Border Water, which maybe people are familiar with in this room, has a different argument, which is that the reason you end up having any kind of border expanse, any kind of border edifice built up, is because local powers are basically fighting for their own mandate to expand. And so the quote he gives, this is the kind of thesis of the book. My aim is to demonstrate how politics are embedded in physical forms. Law enforcement officials have often explained that activities in political terms, justifying their tactics in terms of national security, as measures either in concert with or opposition to commercial agriculture, anti-terrorist, or as public health campaigns, right? So basically he's painting a whole bigger picture about how the whole border was built up by having local institutions claim or cordon off subjects, using this subject as the justification for why their body, their office, should be the ones that are essentially fund receiving. Okay, the BAI, in this case this is agricultural interest, animal interests, right, was the ones who were promoting fence construction. Why? Because of the Texas fever ticks. In other words, he's spinning a different story. The Alvarez story actually isn't really about racialization, it's about institution. Also appreciable. We can understand how, if you think there's a mandate and you're concerned that, he's going to get the mandate or she's going to get the mandate, you'll create the language to justify why you should get the mandate. You get the higher pay raise, you get more staff, and so forth. But what I find interesting is that the more you read, the more it's hard to disentangle these two theses. The race thesis and the institution thesis. So in this book John McKiernan Gonzalez is also a really, really good book about, if you're interested in the history of the US border and the question of medicalization. It's a brilliant book. He would give this talk better than I will, but he's not here and you're stuck with me. But I'll read him. But I'm going to read the quote because it really nails it down how this works together. When the Texas state health officer, this is 1899, so we're in the same window, right, between the initial Texas infestation and the border walling. When Texas state health officer Blunt asked Governor Sayers to impose quarantine on Webb County because of the annual exodus of Mexicans threatens Texas, he effectively equated Mexican labor migration with smallpox. The next day, March 15th, 1899, Blunt declared a statewide quarantine on Laredo. Basic setup. Quarantine, like fencing, physical infrastructure, draw a line, you can't come in, you can't leave. Very basic bordering infrastructure. More interesting, justification. Physicians sought to use the statewide smallpox quarantine to confirm their contribution to the future of the United States, i.e. to secure funding in place and basically federal power. But this is where it gets funny. And again, you kind of have to imagine a politician 120 years ago grandstanding. The Laredo smallpox quarantine also became a spectacle of Texas police authority. Texas state health officer, I'm thinking also of your talk about spectacles. Texas State Health Officer Blunt treated Laredo like a foreign city under a military occupation and demanded a properly certified translator to make sure that the Mexican masses understood his proclamation. He's basically taking the pandemic, drawing a ring around the city, and saying, you Mexicans are the problem, you get out. Why? Because he's trying to make it a spectacle of Texas police authority. In other words, to show and command all the different institutional benefits you reap by being the hero, of having your agency, in this case the police, so not the story before about the BAI. He continues, and this is where the race comes back in. When American and Texas authorities imagined that smallpox or yellow fever might appear in Texas, they envisioned that Mexicans were bringing this disease from Mexico. This supposedly foreign presence allowed them to place their efforts to contain the germ-borne diseases within a transnational field. What he's saying is what they realized is the moment you make it not a pandemic, but you make it the Mexican bump, what you can do is justify the expansion of your authority into a transnational field. And what he goes on to say, basically, is to show the interstices between racialization, or transnationalization in this case, and institutional power. What they realized, it was the moment you make it Mexican, you actually hugely increase your capacity of your office to be the power holder that, essentially dominates. So again, we're asking why, what we can learn from past pandemics, the nature and logic of how these pandemics become racialized is really fascinating, because it's exactly, in some sense, what we see again in the present. Okay. Fine. First cell, though. Fencing, bad cows, good cows. Quarantine, bad Mexicans, good non-Mexicans. Very classic. But the next one is kind of more interesting. Okay, so typhus mirrors smallpox because it's about people in some sense. But typhus ends up becoming not how the perimeter was secured, but a way of justifying filtration or ports of entry. That's why I wanted to separate the two, right? So there's actually two completely different pandemics that justify massive expanses in utterly different ways. So, typhus. We're going to go quickly again. 1870s, we start to realize we should have immigration laws. Everyone knows of like the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882. You start to have, I left out the slide. There's another great, so these inspectors at the border, there weren't very many. They were called Chinese line inspectors because the whole thing was you were going to hunt the Chinese on your horse. Not that different from the image with Haitians, frankly. I forget whose presentation showed those incredible images of the whips. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this speaks to your talk a lot, but okay. Anyways, 1910s, we're fast forwarding through history really quickly. Generally speaking, throughout this period, there's already an awareness you want to control Mexicans and Mexican immigration, and certainly Chinese immigration, because the problem was the Chinese. The moment you said they couldn't come in, how did you stop them from coming in? You stopped them at the ports. That meant places like San Francisco. Port would come in, Chinese would be excluded. That's easy to do because it's maritime. So what would they do? This huge problem, as far as the American government was concerned, of Chinese landing in Mexican ports, then crossing the desert into America, right? So now you need basically something like the beginning of the border guard. That's not till 1924. And the beginning of having the borders be filters so that you can start to exclude based not just on the initial characterization, which is people you don't want, criminals and prostitutes in the beginning, but then also racially, right? So we kind of know this is happening. Fast forward, 1910s, even more so, we're beginning to see the realization we should be filtering at ports of entry. But what's interesting is how long it takes. It takes really long. 1917, we get this big Immigration Act, which includes different kinds of literacy texts. Now, to jump to the future, what do you think happened? Obviously, if the actual border is not controlled and you put literacy tests at the ports of entry, everyone walks around the border, which is why you then need border control to come in 1924. It's a whole mess. They're not stopping anyone. They're not filtering anyone. 1918, new attempts, passport controls. There's another wonderful quote from Rachel St. John to give an idea of just how little there was any control over the actual filtration process at the border, even as late as 1918, okay? This is a letter, a federal letter, sent to the local guy, the local border person, scolding them for not really doing any border checks, to which the person responds. So, Immigration Inspector at Calexico received a letter from his supervisor in El Paso, criticizing him for failing to check passports. He, this is the border guard, this is the customs officer, just a guy, you know, defends his job performance. The people in question, he explained, not only cross every day, but most of them many times each day. And the officers, they really do know them at a glance. In other words, there's just people walking. What he's saying, the guard in El Paso is saying, you can't just let people walk in. And the guy's like, no, 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 we know them. No, these are, come on, we see them every day. To a person unaccustomed to the traffic and the population, it would seem as if the line were wide open. Okay. That sounds, and this is the way she's portraying it, as it was pretty much wide open. Because at this point, there wasn't any control over the perimeter, so the only people crossing the actual port are the people that cross the port all the time. Everyone who you'd actually want to stop is crossing the perimeter. There's basically no filtration mechanism. That's the sum of 1918. Filtration is not an effective thing. So, you already know the punchline. How do we get to a point where suddenly we give a shit about filtering for real? Typhus. Typhus becomes a really big deal. Typhus, 1918, also 17, becomes a whole new world where suddenly what they can do, okay, it used to be that they were just looking for criminals, prostitutes, Chinese people. Now they're justified by the pandemic in stopping all the people. Remember, these are the same Mexicans who, in the same year, were just crossing every day, several times a day. Oh, hey, we know each other, we're all friends. And now the same Mexicans, with no other pretext except for pandemic, are being forced to go through sterilization processes, strip searches, interrogations, etc. So it went from filtering certain people so ineffectively that the people you were filtering out just crossed the desert, and the people you were trying to moderate just walked through, to now basically enforcing sterilization campaigns and strip searches on all the people, basically all of whom were just local Mexicans who had been accustomed to crossing the border because that's what you did. Back to this guy, John McKiernan Gonzalez. If this stuff interests you, I cannot recommend enough to read this book. It's really interesting. 1917, the public health authorities of the US started placing Mexican workers crossing into El Paso in kerosene and vinegar baths. This is the same fucking thing we did to the cows, right? The idea was if you dip a cow, you don't kill the cow, but you kill everything on it. We're doing this to people now, right? Look at it, kerosene and vinegar baths to prevent lice and typhus. Again, whether that's going to work, obviously not for typhus. What's interesting is that's a justification for this policy. In the US, a policy that lasted until the 1930s. That's literally 12 years after the onset of this pandemic. This vivid spectacle probably helped city authorities in El Paso justify separate Mexican and white American field hospitals to treat people suffering from the Spanish flu and create separate and unequal schools to protect American children from dirty, lousy. I always forgot that lousy means like you have lice. It's like a funny etymology. Lousy Mexican children. Okay, again, institutional imperatives, racial imperatives dovetail. But interesting, so the justification not only becomes essentially all kinds of filtration, it also is a really long life. The justification's used 2 decades later. Plods along, and then in the 1930s, we start to care even more because of jobs, because of the Great Depression. And it gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter, all of which beginning in 1918, and all of which originally stemming from the justification of pandemic that essentially then had mission creep and turned into everything else. So, this is the line I find really interesting, that even in the 30s, even though obviously at this point the thing we actually cared about was jobs, the pandemic pretext persisted. Blah, blah, blah. I think I said that already. So back to Rhys Jones. This is the most amazing quote. I don't usually quote Hitler for fun, but apparently, I have not read Mein Kampf, maybe I should. Apparently Hitler said the following about the US border controls in the 1930s, which is a subject Rhys Jones knows really well. I don't at all, but I read this and was like, oh, this is perfect. Hitler writes, "There is today one state in which at least weak beginnings towards a better conception of what, you can imagine, are noticeable. Of course, it is not our model German Republic, but the American Union, in which an effort is made to consult reason at least partially. We know Hitler's program, the kind of racial exclusion Hitler is interested in. But the reason America's exemplary is because of health. By refusing immigration on principle to elements in poor health, by simply excluding certain races from naturalization, it professes in slow beginnings a view which is going to take off and become Hitler's view of the world." So it's exactly the intersection of essentially health exclusion and racial exclusion, which of course is exactly what Americans were doing, that Hitler fetishized. Okay, that's the big walk through the history of American border in 15 minutes, which, as any of you who've actually studied the US-Mexican border, was like a whistle-stop tour that left out everything, but whatever. It was a parable. I think that's the way of describing it. It is a parable in which I have plucked certain justificatory moments to maybe analyze. We're going to do that now. So, take-homes. Obvious, stupid, boring point. Pandemic justifies border expansion. Slightly more interesting point. They're very different, right? So you have the 1909, the Texas fever, is the thing that justifies perimeter security, is very different than the 1918 typhus story, in which invasive security protocols were justified. So actually, it's not helpful to say it's a justification for border expansion. Turns out, hugely different kinds of profiles of expansion are afforded the same possibility. So, two conclusions. The one is that the ways in which pandemic can be used to justify border expansion, even 100 years ago, was varied and manifold. But more interestingly, turns out that that pandemic is really malleable. You can kind of make a pandemic fit any institutional purpose you want. That's really interesting. Second, the pandemic influence on border policy was seriously delayed. And incidentally, this is the slide that made me give up on trying to talk about the present, because it's way more interesting to realize that we have no idea what's going to happen in 15 years. So, in the 1880s, Texas fever was used to justify border fencing 30 years later, when it had almost entirely died out, by the way. 1917 typhus outbreak continued to justify invasive body searches through the 30s, okay? So what does that mean? It means that A, we should be a little bit careful in the way we talk about the effect of the pandemic, because the truth is that the real effect or the delayed effect might be 30 years from now, which is scary. But I think this is the kicker. This is the main point for me, which is that I think what I learned from this little walkthrough of the history of the border, which this is all this is. It's like a slow walkthrough, a quick walkthrough of this history, is that you have to distinguish the difference between the pandemic as a threat versus the pandemic as a justification. Because in most of these cases, the threat was long past, but the justification not only kept going, it kept getting stronger. So you essentially have two completely different curves, right? Where the threat recedes, but the justification doesn't just continue, it grows. That's a hugely different conclusion than I think I would have thought of before I started this little fun romp through history books. Third, boy was it quick that the epidemiological crisis turned into a racial or national one. Again, from the vantage of the present, not surprising. But from the vantage of me not knowing what it would have been like way in the past, it was just way more immediate than I thought, or knew, because I guess I didn't know. Maybe it's stupid, maybe I should have known. Irasema's nodding, which is her way of saying, you're stupid, you should have known. In the 1880s, the concern about cattle ticks, right, was basically turned into get off our land, right? This is our land, not your land. Our area is going to be pure with our lovely cows, and we're going to take your dirty cows and send them away. 1910s, 20s, the stereotype about Mexicans as being dirty or unhygienic, which again, we completely see through the present. To go back to Mark's talk earlier, I mean, that's roughly the same slide as when we talk about how the mean things we said about those Mexican students, in a way. It's the same stereotype. The Mexican bump is just a nasty way of saying a thing that in a way those insults are still the same we use. But okay, so what are the conclusions? Obviously the interesting one is it's amazing how quickly a non-racial or non-national thing becomes a racial or national thing to justify racial or national exclusion. But it made me think a lot about climate change, which is that I don't actually know whether or not the real lesson about the pandemic is anything to do with corona. I think the lesson about the pandemic is that we should be concerned about the racialization of and the institutional expanse that climate change will bring. I don't know what 20 years debates will be like now, but if I'm predicting, I think we're going to start, if we start to use climate change to expand institutional powers, we will start to see it racialized. I think it's kind of an interesting outcome when you think of how a non-racial thing becomes racial. That would seem to me like the scary, really scary next step. Some concerns. Unlike our last speaker, who presented a rosy view of peace, maybe not in our lifetime, this will not end in that same vein. So, how do we prevent COVID from becoming a justification for selective admissions? That initial fear I felt, and I think probably many of you felt, that ultimately this is going to become 10 years, 20 years down the line, where medicalized passports are the justification for exclusion. We have to start to see whether or not there are correlations between the exclusion of national groupings and the rejection of their medical records. I tend to think you'll start to see that. On a more localized level, meaning at the person level, you want to ask, how do you prevent COVID from justifying racial discrimination? You'd want to see a similar kind of correlation in the politics of profiling, whether people of certain kinds of ethnic markers, skin colors, religion types, whatevers, start to, at least statistically, have their medical data disapproved or rejected or taken to secondary or so forth or whatever. I would imagine these are two conclusions you would draw looking forward from what I just talked about. And the third is a much more speculative one, and one I really talk about a lot in other stuff that I write and I work on, which is the question of whether or not what borders really do is border territories or border populations. In a really broad brush, the old model before Westphalia, before sovereignty, like the medieval model, was that you were the king of a people, like you controlled a population. And then the newer model that Westphalia brought in, and this again is really broad brush, became over territory. I think what's interesting about medicalized passports is that the dream of the sovereign state was never to say we should be territory, not people. It was to be territory and people. And you start to wonder whether or not population level medicalized forms of exclusion allow the sovereign state to have more capacity in that regard, which they already do about non-citizens, right? But we don't really yet about citizens. And I think you're going to start to see that, which I find really terrifying. Thank you.
Bear with me, I have beer-related information at the end of this. Whatever it takes. Chers amis, dear friends, merci infiniment. Ça a été 2 jours très occupés. We've had a busy 2 days. We've been around the world, literally, and we've crossed many borders. Thank you very much, Matthew. It was perfect. Did you know of the Africanized bees and the fact that they've dreamt, the Americans, to build some electrified fences to prevent the killer bees from coming from Brazil into the US. We'll talk about that, it's fun. Well, fun, interesting. The videos of the panels will be available online shortly, and the virtual panels that took place before the conference are already online. Do not hesitate to follow Border Walls on Twitter, because we will keep on tweeting about the next conference. I would like to thank at that stage the wonderful team Geopo at the back, and the Raoul Dandurand Chair logistics, the tech people also. Thank you very much, you've been great. I would like to thank the chairs, especially those who are not border scholars. Some of them were international lawyers, so it was the only way I could find to bring them and hope they tag along. My deepest thanks also go to the scientific committee. We've had a record submissions this year, so really put you to work. The selection wasn't easy. Anne-Laura Milazari, Mathilde Bourgeon, Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, Naomi Shi, Irasema Coronado, Susan Arbage-Page, UC Lane, Christine Lundberger, Matthew Longo, Kenneth Madsen, Saeed Sadiki, James Scott, Margaret Walker, and Mirza Rahman. That is to say that those whose name have not been mentioned here will be solicited for the next edition. And the next edition is really depending on you. If you are willing to come back to Montreal, it will, and we always do that. Like, you know, if at one point somebody says, no, we're done, we're done. But as long as people are saying, like, we'd like to come back, we kind of plan now for the next edition. Since 2024 will be a US presidential election, and we try not to get involved in this, it should be probably May 2025, which means that the call for papers will be 8 to 10 months before. We'll keep you posted. Chers amis, dear friends, un grand merci, a big thank you to all. It has been a pleasure listening to you and exchanging with you. Once again, thanks to ABS and the SHIRC for their support. Thank you very much. Merci.